Some battles are louder in silence than any shout ever heard. The creak of the wooden church doors was familiar, but today the sound echoed differently in Malachi's chest. He stepped inside, letting the cold from outside cling to his coat for just a moment longer than necessary. He gave a polite nod to the usher but avoided locking eyes with anyone. His usual smile, it showed up, but only halfway. He took his seat in the back pew where the lighting was dimmer and the hymns felt farther away. Agnes Blake, seated 2 rows ahead, turned just enough to glance over her shoulder, her lips pursed as if in subtle disapproval, but she turned back to her hymnal without a word. The choir began its first verse. Malachi didn't sing. He stared at the stained glass window above the altar, a depiction of the prodigal son. The colors blurred slightly, maybe from the condensation of the cold, or perhaps something behind his eyes. He blinked and shifted in his seat, hands clasped tightly as if he were holding together something fraying inside him. After the sermon, while people greeted each other with the usual "God bless you" and "Happy early Thanksgiving," Malachi quietly slipped out the side exit. The laughter and conversation trailed behind him like perfume he no longer recognized. His apartment was a small second-floor unit above a consignment shop that had been closed since October. The heating was unreliable, so Malachi kept a blanket draped over his shoulders as he settled into his evening routine tea, psalms, and the one thing no one else knew about his journal. It wasn't a diary in the traditional sense. It was a battleground. Every page wrestled with scripture, shame, and salvation. Tonight's entry was shorter, tighter. "Lord, I made it through the service without running. That's something. But my thoughts, you saw them. You always do." I didn't look at her, but I thought about it. The desire to be known touched. It's louder when I'm trying to listen to you. I failed. You again. And still here I am, still hoping you haven't given up on me. He closed the journal gently, as if it could feel, placing it beneath his pillow. Malachi leaned back into his couch, staring at the ceiling fan that hadn't moved in weeks. The silence wrapped around him, not comforting, but familiar. There had been a time when he'd felt fire in his prayer life, when fasting meant closeness, when he believed freedom was a process with a finish line. But now, it felt like trudging through a fog that only thickened with time. He recalled Reverend Thomas's voice during the sermon. God sees the heart, and he stays. A part of Malachi wanted to believe that. Another part whispered, but what if the heart is tired of fighting? Downstairs, the door to the consignment shop creaked open and shut, likely the landlord checking the pipes again. Malachi didn't move. He stayed seated, one hand on his Bible, the other on the armrest, holding his breath for no reason at all. The heater kicked in with a loud clang, making him flinch. He shook his head, chuckling quietly at himself. Maybe tomorrow he'd try fasting again. Maybe. He stood stretched and turned off the light. But unknown to Malachi, someone else had already found his journal. Secrets are safest until someone believes they know the truth. At Old Brew, the air smelled of cinnamon and overbrewed coffee. Agnes Blake stirred her cup twice, once clockwise, once against. It was a habit not from superstition, but from repetition. She liked order, she liked clarity, and she disliked confusion in her church, especially if it came wearing a nice shirt and a too quiet smile. Across from her sat Emily Carter, barely 20, all nerves and quick glances. She had been helping clean up after a youth gathering the night before her first time volunteering in weeks. "I didn't mean to read it," Emily said, hands wrapped around a warm mug. It was just there, under the seat cushion. Agnes narrowed her eyes. What was? Emily hesitated, then reached into her bag. She unfolded a few printed pages, slightly crooked, photocopied at the library. "I made copies of a few entries. I thought someone should see this. Just in case." Agnes took the papers. She adjusted her glasses, reading in silence, while the cafe's jazz version of Silent Night tinkled overhead. One line stood out immediately. I imagined touching her hand. Just her hand. But even that felt sinful. She exhaled slowly. Not a gasp, not outrage, but something else. Tight disapproval. as if a crooked picture had just been nailed into her living room wall. "You're sure this is from Malachi?" she asked. Emily nodded. His name's on the inside cover, and the handwriting he always takes sermon notes in that exact cursive. Agnes didn't speak for a long while. When she finally did, her voice was level. "Thank you, Emily. You did the right thing." Outside, the wind tugged at Agnes's coat as she made her way to the church office. Reverend Thomas wasn't in, but the assistant gave her access to the copy machine. She placed the sheets face down and pressed start. Each click and whir of the machine felt like moral weight being made tangible. 12 sets, neatly stapled, anonymous envelopes to follow. By Thursday, the church grapevine had bloomed subtly respectfully, but with the efficiency only small towns knew, Malachi's absence from the Wednesday night prayer meeting was noted. So was the pastor's unusually somber demeanor. Agnes didn't speak of what she'd read directly. She didn't need to. She simply asked for prayers for clarity and truth within our leadership. The phrase did its job. Reverend Thomas returned to his office that evening to find a manila envelope on his desk. No return name. Inside the same pages Agnes had read, now carefully retyped and highlighted. The final page bore a simple message: protect the sheep. Don't let the wolves hide behind scripture. He sat down heavily. Outside, the lamppost flickered. He knew Malachi had been quiet more than usual. But this was different. He reread the words. Pain bled from them, not manipulation. The entries spoke of struggle, not seduction. And yet the ambiguity was dangerous in a place like Asheville, where image and integrity were interwoven like grapevine on a trellis. At home, Agnes placed one of the original copies into a white envelope addressed in neat block letters to Deacon Harold. Personal. She lit a candle in her kitchen, brewed herbal tea, and turned on her favorite gospel radio. When the host began to speak about silent dangers in the flock, she smiled faintly, unaware of the irony. By Sunday, whispers no longer hid behind prayers. People exchanged glances instead of greetings. Children were hushed when they asked, "Where's Mr. Malachi today?" And still no one had spoken to him. And by Sunday, there would be a seat empty where Malachi once sat. In small towns, a whisper can sound like a verdict. The bells of Grace Baptist Church rang with familiar melody that morning. But to Malachi, they sounded distant, hollow, like echoes in an empty hallway. He stood just outside the doors, his breath visible in the crisp December air, unsure whether to walk in or keep walking forever. But he did go in. Inside, the sanctuary was warm, bright with poinsettias and soft candlelight. The pews were half full already. Older couples bundled in scarves and coats exchanging smiles, laughter, and gentle commentary on the frost outside. He slipped into his usual spot on the back row. No one turned to greet him. Mrs. Blake, who always offered him a bulletin and a sweet smile, kept her eyes fixed ahead. Deacon Harold, usually full of firm handshakes and young man affirmations, avoided eye contact altogether. Malachi swallowed hard. His palms were cold. The choir began, and the sound should have comforted him. It didn't. Even the familiar strains of Come Thou Fount felt like they were for someone else now. He glanced at his Bible resting in his lap, thumbed through the thin pages, but didn't read. He couldn't focus. His mind wandered to the journal, the one he now kept locked away. Was it possible someone had read it? He shook the thought. He hadn't told anyone, hadn't shown anyone, but the air felt different. Too quiet, too still. Like everyone was holding their breath around him. When Reverend Thomas stepped to the pulpit, his usual warmth was there, but it was laced with something else. Restraint, maybe, or tension. Brothers and sisters, he began today. I want to speak about the importance of discernment, of keeping our hearts pure, of recognizing when wolves dress like sheep. Malachi felt the sting before he even fully processed the words. His body went still except for a tiny twitch in his jaw. He didn't look around. He didn't need to. He could feel their gazes even when they pretended not to look. After the sermon, the usual slow trickle of conversation resumed, but it moved around him like water around a rock. A few murmured good morning as they passed, but none lingered. No invitations to lunch, no questions about his week, just space and silence. He made his way toward the exit, but before he reached the doors, Agnes appeared beside him, her posture straighter than usual. "Malachi," she said, voice polite, formal, like a business meeting. "Do you have a moment?" He nodded. She handed him a plain manila envelope. "I think it's only fair you read what others have." His stomach sank. She didn't elaborate, just gave a thin smile and walked away, coat swishing as she joined another group near the front. Back home, Malachi sat at his kitchen table, the envelope resting in front of him. He stared at it for several minutes before opening it. Inside were typed pages, familiar words, his own words, except now they looked different. Naked, stripped of context, stripped of tone. No prayers, no hope. Just fragmented thoughts. Desire, shame, longing, confusion assembled like evidence in a trial. One line was underlined. "The flesh still wins even when I kneel." He closed his eyes. How had something meant for confession turned into condemnation? He folded the pages carefully, returned them to the envelope, and placed it in the trash. That night he didn't pray. He packed. Sometimes exile feels more honest than belonging. Malachi didn't say goodbye to anyone. He didn't leave a note or a voicemail. He simply pulled his coat tighter against the early evening wind, slung a worn canvas bag over his shoulder, and walked. He walked past the church, past Old Brew, past the houses with flickering Christmas lights, past the mailbox stuffed with donation letters. He never opened. He walked until the pavement thinned into gravel and gravel into dirt, until the road no longer knew his name. The bridge stood just beyond the edge of the map in his mind, where the river curved like an old scar through the woods. He didn't plan to stop there. It just felt like the right kind of nowhere. But someone else had found it first. From a distance, he saw her, a slender figure standing on the wooden railing, arms outstretched like wings. The light was fading fast, and the water below was black and silent. He froze. Then quietly, gently, he stepped forward, crunching a few dry leaves underfoot. No sudden movements. No words yet. She didn't turn. "I wouldn't jump there," he said softly. "It's not deep enough. Just cold." She stiffened but didn't move. "I don't want to talk," she replied. Her voice was raw, cracked, like someone who hadn't spoken in days. "I won't make you," he said, taking another step closer. "Just don't move yet." A beat passed. "I'm Malachi." She turned slightly. Just her head. Blonde hair in a messy bun, tear-streaked cheeks red. "Hoodie, no coat." "Sophie," she said. "Don't remember asking." He smiled faintly, fair. He sat down on the ground near the railing, not touching it. Let the cold seep into his jeans. It anchored him. "You picked a quiet spot," he said. "Yeah, figured no one would notice." "I would have." "That's not helpful," she muttered. "I know." They sat in silence for a long while, the river whispering below them. Finally, she broke it. "You ever feel like everyone sees you, but no one actually sees you?" Malachi nodded slowly. "Every Sunday." She glanced at him for the first time. Her expression softened just slightly. "You churchy or something?" "I used to be. Or maybe I still am. Depends on who you ask." She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. He continued. "I wrote things down. Struggles, thought stuff. I didn't want to speak aloud. Someone read them, shared them. Now everyone thinks they know me." She blinked. "That's awful." He shrugged. "It's familiar." Sophie looked back at the water. "Someone at my church. Someone who was supposed to help people. He hurt me. No one believed me. They still don't." The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was holy. Malachi didn't flinch, didn't ask who, didn't say he was sorry. He just let her speak. "I don't want to go back," she whispered. "You don't have to go back," he replied. "But maybe don't disappear either." She turned to look at him again. Her eyes were red-tired, searching. "Why are you here?" He paused. "I think I came here to disappear too, but I saw you first." Sirens echoed faintly in the distance. Sophie lowered herself from the railing, stepping down slowly. Malachi offered his hand. She hesitated, then took it and took. When Reverend Thomas pulled up in his car, bundled in a scarf and concern, Sophie's fingers were still curled around Malachi's. He wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and didn't ask any questions, just nodded at Malachi as if to say, "Thank you." By the time the police arrived, Reverend Thomas was already waiting with a blanket and tears in his eyes. Restoration begins in the most unexpected places. For Sophie, it was the smell of cinnamon oatmeal and the sound of classical guitar playing from Reverend Thomas's kitchen speaker. For Malachi, it was the surprise of being told to stay and mean it. "You'll take the guest room," Thomas had said simply, "No arguments." That had been 2 days ago. Sophie slept in the room across the hall, just past the study where Thomas kept his grandfather's Bible and a small lamp that flickered like candlelight. No one rushed anything. No one asked too much. It was the first silence Malachi had known that didn't feel like judgment. This morning, Sophie sat curled on the couch with a knitted blanket over her knees, watching the flames in the fireplace like they were telling her secrets. "You always this quiet?" she asked without looking at him. Malachi smiled from the chair across the room. "Only when I'm in good company," she snorted softly. "Lame." He raised an eyebrow. "Honest. Mrs. Hensley." Graceful, gentle, with eyes that never blinked. Too Fast arrived shortly after breakfast. She greeted Sophie with a warm hug and no clipboard, and when they disappeared into the study, Malachi took his coffee out to the porch, letting the cold nip his face. He didn't know what healing looked like for Sophie, but for now, this felt like holy ground. That afternoon, Sophie found him in the backyard, pacing a small trail of crushed leaves. "You walk like an old man," she teased. "I'm practicing." "Why?" "So I'll be believable when I'm full of wisdom," she grinned. Then her tone softened. "Can I ask you something real?" He nodded. "That journal. Why write it all down?" He paused. "Because I was afraid of what it had become if I didn't." She nodded slowly. "I read it. Before all this, I thought you were a fraud," she admitted. "But the more I read, the more I thought, me too." He met her eyes. "It wasn't meant for anyone else, but I'm glad it found you." They sat on the old stone bench by the French Broad River, the water gliding past with quiet confidence. Sophie picked at a pine cone, then spoke again. "I think I want to say something in public, not just to Mrs. Hensley." Malachi tilted his head like a testimony. "Maybe," she said, "not the fancy kind, just the true kind." He looked ahead, exhaled. "Thomas is planning a Christmas Eve gathering. For stories," he said. "Not sermons." She raised her eyebrows. "You gonna speak?" "I wasn't planning to." "Then I will if you do." Back at the house, Reverend Thomas stirred soup on the stove. The radio murmured softly behind him, broadcasting carols sung with low, warm harmonies. He listened as Sophie and Malachi entered the kitchen, laughing about something he didn't catch. Without turning, he said, "Christmas Eve, 7 o'clock. You two are at the top of the list." They froze. Then Malachi chuckled. "Eavesdropping, Reverend. Spirit-led intuition," he said with a wink. Sophie nudged Malachi. "We're doing it." He hesitated, then smiled. "Amen." Forgiveness doesn't always come with applause, but it always comes with light. The sanctuary smelled faintly of pine and wax. Candles flickered on each windowsill, their soft halos dancing against the stained glass. The choir had finished warming up, and the pews slowly filled with townspeople bundled in scarves and coats, some with expectation, others with curiosity, and a few with subtle skepticism. It was Christmas Eve. Malachi stood behind the partition, his heart beating in sync with the soft organ chords floating through the room. He wasn't dressed to impress, just a navy sweater and slacks. No robe, no title, just a man with something true to say. Across the room, Sophie sat beside Reverend Thomas. Her hair was brushed, her expression calm, but her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a folded piece of paper. "You ready?" Malachi whispered as he stepped beside her. She looked up, then smiled. "No, but I'm doing it anyway." Reverend Thomas stepped up first. "Tonight is a night of stories," he said, his voice rich and low and light. "Because the world gets dark, and sometimes the only light we have left is the one someone else dares to hold up." He turned, nodded. Sophie went first. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. She didn't speak in metaphors, just facts. A teenage girl once full of hope, a betrayal, silence, shame. And then one night, a bridge. She glanced toward Malachi. "He didn't save me with a sermon," she said. "He saved me by sitting still and not looking away." There wasn't a sound in the room. "I used to think God only liked people who had it together. But then I met someone who was falling apart and God was still with him, so maybe he's still with me too." She stepped down without applause, but many in the room blinked faster than usual. Malachi walked up next. He didn't carry notes, just the journal worn fragile, tucked under his arm. "I won't read from it," he said. "Not anymore." He looked around slowly, meeting faces. "I used to think writing down my struggles would help me bury them, but all it did was show me how deep they ran. And when those pages got passed around, I thought it was punishment. He paused, but then someone found hope in them. And that changed everything. He turned to Sophie. She taught me that broken people don't need perfect leaders. They need present ones. He stepped back, not needing more. In the pews, Agnes Blake clutched her hymnal tightly. When the service ended and people began to shuffle out, she didn't move right away. Then she stood and walked up to Malachi. He didn't speak. Neither did she for a moment. Then, "I'm sorry," she whispered. He simply nodded. "Thank you." She squeezed his arm gently before leaving into the winter night. Later, as the sanctuary emptied, Reverend Thomas approached Malachi near the side door. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small brass key. "What's this?" Malachi asked. Thomas pressed it into his palm. "Prayer room. Back of the church. Been empty too long." Malachi looked down at the key, then up at his old mentor. "You're giving me the room." "No," Thomas said, smiling. "I'm giving you what comes with it." And as the final hymn played, Malachi stood by the door, not to leave, but to welcome. There are battles we never see. But when someone chooses kindness instead of judgment, light breaks through the darkest places. Malachi's journey wasn't about perfection, but presence. And Sophie's voice, once silenced by fear, became the song of second chances. Sometimes the ones who fall the hardest are the ones most ready to help others stand, like a candle quietly burning in a window. A simple act of compassion can guide us through the longest nights.